My business is murder. I spend my days thinking up new and unusual ways to kill without getting caught, and driving around looking for the best place to dispose of bodies. Every person I meet on the street is a potential new victim, and dark alleys are a crime scene in waiting. I am a crime writer, and my currencies are blood, violence, and death, themes that seem to permeate our media, culture, and entertainment. Crime in its multiple formats, from film and TV to books and video games, is a globally best-selling genre. As consumers, we seem inexplicably attracted by violence. But should it be entertainment? Is there something wrong with us? Do crime novels simply reflect the problems in modern society, or do they add to them? And crucially, this: should anyone really be making money from murder? Stories about death are as old as history. Greek tragedies and Egyptian mythology are full of familial murders. Grimm's fairy tales are packed full of terrible deaths. But we have to look beyond literature to find the origins of our fascination with violence as entertainment. The Roman Colosseum could hold 50,000 people. Now, that might not be as many as watch Netflix every evening, but just imagine the sound of the crowd roaring as they watched soldiers and slaves and wild animals fight to the death. And it's thought that 200,000 people turned out to watch notorious highwayman Jack Sheppard hang at London's Tyburn Tree in 1724. Now, in context, that was 1/3 of the population of London at that time. But in spite of our timeless fascination with conflict, arguably the real world is violent enough without creators adding more murder and mayhem through fiction. So is the media we consume putting toxic ideas in our heads and influencing our behavior in the same way that the junk food that we eat sickens our bodies? Now, in 1977, horror writer Stephen King wrote a story called Rage about a school shooting. Rage went on to be associated with a number of real school shootings in the 1980s and 1990s. In all cases, the perpetrator had read the book, and they either had a copy of it in their locker or they quoted from it. As a result, King withdrew that book from publication. William Powell's The Anarchist Cookbook was linked to the Columbine school shooting, and J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye was said to have been inspirational in the murder of John Lennon. But whilst it's not realistic to think that a story can turn a mentally stable, trouble-free person into a deranged killer, it might be the case that a book embeds a fantasy into more detailed planning. It might give permission for violent behavior, or be inspirational, or be a catalyst. Now, crime fiction most often contains a murder at the heart of a mystery, but also often touches on other societal problems such as abuse, abandonment, betrayal, drugs, or human trafficking. Writers create whole worlds where the very worst of mankind is on show. But arguably, sadly, there's enough of that in the news. Many people believe that a diet of fictionalized crime leads to a cultural normalization of violent behavior. Studies have shown that even brief exposure to violent video games leads to a temporary increase in aggressive behavior from all types of participants. And recently, television programs have been criticised for casting popular, good-looking actors in the roles of psychopaths. You might have seen Jamie Dornan, best known for 50 Shades of Grey, transitioned to become a serial killer in The Fall, and High School Musical teenage heartthrob Zac Efron playing Ted Bundy. So it's not a great leap to conclude that fictionalized crime softens our approach to real crime. We become fascinated by it rather than horrified by it. We immerse ourselves in it rather than shielding ourselves from it. And then there are the extensions to the mainstream, such as the darknet, where we can go and actually watch videos, or even worse, watch live streams of crimes as they occur. So is crime fiction something like a gateway drug that leads to our ever-increasing thirst for violence? Publishers want writers to produce gripping tales that readers say they can't put down. They want big twists and gasp-out-loud moments. And they want new and ever more terrifying antagonists. But they don't want the reader to be so scared that they can't read the book. Yet it remains almost impossible to know where that line is drawn. So that's what I'm going to try to do now. And to that end, there's a little more you need to know about me. Earlier in my working life, I practiced as a barrister for 15 years, prosecuting and defending in criminal trials. The books I write now are at the darker end of the crime fiction marketplace. Readers quite often choose my books because I write scary, tense, unflinching fiction. Now, that might not make much sense, given that I've had to deal with real victims and deal with real perpetrators of violence. You might be forgiven for thinking that thinking up yet more terrible things in my head would be the last thing that I would want to do. But let me add a little more. Before I became a lawyer, the day after my 16th birthday, in fact, I was raped. The man who assaulted me was a police officer and the leader of a community group that I attended. And I was too ashamed to tell my parents and too intimidated to go to the police. And so I buried it, because that's how most victims cope with the trauma. I didn't really talk about that for another 2 decades, because I was afraid that no one would believe me. And that, tragically, is also a story as old as time. But I've grown used to talking about it over the years, because I believe that unless women do talk openly about these things, the world won't change. And we need to encourage people to disclose such assaults. Having written about it for a newspaper, though, I was contacted by someone on social media who said they didn't believe that I'd really been the victim of that crime. Because how could I write about such horrible crimes if I'd really been the victim of one? That made me think very hard about why I write crime, not the reasons why I shouldn't write it, but all the reasons why it feels important for me to do so. And it boils down to this: it's far more important that we tell these stories than we pretend that these things don't happen. Imagine a scenario where young women grow up in a world where they read things and see interpretations of a world that feels entirely happy and safe, only to be met with all the reasons and the harsh reality why they have to protect themselves. I often write now from the victim's perspective. I write graphic scenes with all the pain and detail so that we can't see crime as just a series of statistics. I have more of a problem with the rise in the genre that's the so-called cozy crime. Oh, look, there's a body in the corner of the library. How exciting. Shall we solve the mystery? Because that misses the point. Where there's a body, there's been grief and loss and fear. I want my readers to think about what a victim went through, whether they negotiated for their life or ran or fought. And I want to show the impact on friends and family and community. More than that, I want people to know that anyone can be a victim of crime, no matter how tough or safe we think we are, and that anyone can be a criminal, no matter what they look like, what job they do, uniform they wear, and no matter how kind or holy or authoritative or responsible they seem. My mission is to move readers through my stories. The bits in my books that are hard to read, I quite often have written with tears streaming down my face and a lump in my throat. But I also write to entertain, and I don't apologize for that. Having been a victim of crime, it's cathartic to now be able to control the narrative. And I figure I'm owed something for what happened to me. But there are things I won't write. I rarely write about children because I'm a mother, and that's very hard for me. And if I write about sexual assault, I'm very careful. It has to be peripheral but important to the plot. And the way we depict crime, the language we use, the detail we go into, that's important too. Because if we get it wrong, it's just gratuitous and exploitative. I don't believe the books make good people do bad things. Psychopathic tendencies most often come from a failure of nurture, such as childhood abuse, and sometimes because individuals naturally lack empathy. Most experts agree it's usually a combination of the two, a perfect storm of upbringing and nature. But books reflect life rather than life reflecting books. And quite often I turn on the news and see stories and think, if I put them into my books, no one would believe them. But on empathy, as a side note, it's really heartening to know that actually the more we read fiction, even crime fiction, the more empathetic we become. If we allow ourselves to be transported through stories, our affective empathy will improve. And if we read fiction, all fiction long-term, our cognitive empathy will improve, and that's being able to recognize and understand other people's mental states. So even fictionalized violence can have a positive effect on us and our interactions with other people. Now, let me tell you something about each of you. Pupilometry, that's the study of how our pupils respond to different stimuli, shines a light into the darkness of our unconscious. It tells us what we're excited by, even if we don't want to admit those things to ourselves. What's that got to do with crime fiction and whether or not we enjoy a good thriller? Well, it's this. If I put a photo up here now of a dead body, no matter how horrific. No, I'm not going to. It's okay. But if I did, every single one of you would react in the same way. Your pupils would dilate. You would show, in the most basic terms, a sense of exhilaration. That's just something to go home and think about. But what of my own moral dilemma, making money from murder? Well, I believe that stories help us understand ourselves. Crime fiction looks at what it means to be human. I know it's helped me come to terms with the things that have happened to me. And just as long as writers aren't promoting violence or glamorizing violence, then nothing should be off limits. And after all, in the end, it's far better that we spill blood on the page and not on the streets. Thank you.
Zaurala som, zaurala